We have 84 authors and creative artists with us tonight. That's a record. Let me introduce our authors, and please hold your applause until the end. Chicago is the home of Poetry Foundation, so it's only fitting our first author is Kuresh Lansana, a fixture on the Chicago poetry scene, and the author of a tribute to Gwendolyn Brooks that Rick Cogan calls essential for anybody who has any feeling for Chicago literature. Allison Amond is a novelist who turned the Galapagos Islands into a spy thriller and a portrait of a complicated marriage in Enchanted Islands. Blue Balliet has used the Chicago art scene as the setting for many of her young adult mysteries. But next March, she sets her resourceful heroes loose in Nantucket for Out of the Wild Night. Pamela Banos is a photographer who scours the flea markets to find vintage snapshots that she can turn into animated art, as you see on the walls. This year, her authoritative biography of Vivian Maier makes you wonder what is real and what is not. Elizabeth Berg has written 20 books, including New York Times bestsellers, and she is destined to make the list again with the story of Arthur Trulove. And while we're on the subject of Walking Dead, meet Jay Banasinga, the Chicago author who's turned Robert Kirkman's TV series into 8 original novels. We have no maps without the maps that come before. Mary Jean Boric writes in her award-winning memoir, and to prove it, she wears a tattoo of the Chicago skyline on her back. We are so proud. Maybe she'll, well, never mind. Ed Burke is the dean of the Chicago City Council. He has served his Southwest Side ward for 48 years and written 3 books on Chicago history. Start with a PhD in mathematics, add in a lifelong love for cooking and music, sprinkle in one appearance on the Stephen Colbert Show, and you have Eugenia Cheng's recipe for how to bake pie. People forget facts, but they can never forget a good story, says Esther Choi, founder of the Leadership Story Lab. Let the story do the work. Shows you how to tell your own story. John Conroy comes from a long line of investigative reporters who speak truth to power, first in his reporting on the police torture case of Commander John Burge, and again in his remarkable play, My Kind of Town. If you're looking for poetry that's louder than a bomb, look no further than Kevin Koval, the founder of the world-renowned, there it is. Thank you. The History of Chicago is a collection of his latest poems. Look at that picture. Wow. And that one. From the Civil War to the Indian Wars, Peter Cousins has illuminated the history of America's westward expansion in 17 books. His latest made Smithsonian Magazine's top 10 book last year. Funny, sweet, strange, and as comforting as a cup of tea from the neighbor. That's how critics have greeted Elizabeth Crane's new story collection, Turf, her 5th since being recognized with our 21st Century Award. Hello, my name is Ice Cream. Sounds like a pickup line at a Dairy Queen. It's also the title of a new book of dessert recipes for Dana Cree, the Chicago pastry chef, who was twice nominated for a James Beard Award. 3 generations of Vida Cross's family have lived in Bronzeville, and she brings back the good times and the bad in her new book, Bronzeville at Night. Vida? This January, University of Chicago professor Jane Daly joins other prominent historians in offering a unique 2-volume history of the United States, online and free, that draws on her research into the Jim Crow laws of the South. Rickshaw Reggie knows Chicago, and for that we can thank first-time author Kathleen Dragan and her fanciful children's guide to Chicago neighborhoods. Stuart Dybeck turned a boyhood in Pilsen and Little Village into the coast of Chicago and One Book, One Chicago selection. Over the next 30 years, he's won awards too numerous to mention, so we won't, Stuart. His latest is the start of something. Tom Dyja has seen Chicago from a different perspective. His profiles of famous Chicagoans who built the American dream was also a One Book, One Chicago selection. What's with the coast thing? We'll get back home. Yes, there was a time when all the intrigue in Washington was fiction. And the job of keeping that fiction fictional goes to House of Cards executive story editor Laura Eason, a Northwestern grad and ensemble member of the Looking Glass Theater Company. Donald Trump has nothing on Eve Ewing in the Twitter sphere. With 85,000 followers, her Wikipedia Brown speaks to a new generation of political activists. And her first debut book about a black girl growing up to be a black woman is lighting up the blogosphere. And I give a lot of credit to her mother, Sylvia Ewing, a longtime presence in the Chicago broadcast scene. But did you know that she has found a second career giving comfort and joy to the people around her?
For Valentine's Day, I thought I'd buy a gun. That is how crazy I've become.
Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl spent 130 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, and the movie grossed over $370 million. Can her new book top that? Here's a hint. Never bet against a woman with a killer instinct. I wish you wouldn't sit behind me. Jerry Fogelson is an honored name in the Chicago Real Estate Hall of Fame. He tells this story of how he turned the rail yard south of Grant Park into residential high-rises in his new book, Central Station. Al Jenney is a professor of business ethics at Loyola and resident philosopher at WBEZ. As good a perch as any to weigh in on the importance of being funny. Keir Graff spends his days as executive editor of Booklist and his nights as the author of 3 political novels and 2 acclaimed books for teenagers. The last was named a Best of the Best by the Chicago Public Library. One day, I want to be called what Kathy Graham is. And if you'll see on the side, you'll want to go to that party after this. She is an entertainment guru. But this inventive designer and illustrator earns the title with her unique book on the art of creating sensational parties. If you think the Field Museum is just a collection of petrified dinosaur bones and insects pinned to wax, Lance Grand wants you to think again. He spent 3 decades traveling the world, refining paleontology, and the curators takes you along on the journey. Brian Gruley is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the Wall Street Journal who is intrigued by a little town called Starvation Lake. He'll find his way to us and there as well. He's here tonight as the author of 3 terrific novels that dive beneath its surface. He's doing research, of course, with his video section. Hermine Hartman and David Smallwood are the 1-2 punch behind Indigo Legacy, a deluxe edition of 103 stories from the second largest black magazine in America. Hartman is the founder and CEO of Indigo, and Smallwood is its editor. Robert Hellinga has taught English at Knox College for almost 50 years, but still found time to write 8 acclaimed novels. Doug Hare was the creative inspiration for the floral planters that run down the middle of Michigan Avenue. Thank you. As a landscape architect himself, his innovative integration of nature into urban settings make us all appreciate the beauty around us. They get a few votes, too. Chicago in the 1920s sounds a lot like 2017, doesn't it? It was a wild and woolly place, and no one took advantage more than Leo Koretz. His Ponzi scheme to bilk investors puts Bernie Madoff to shame. Empire of Deception is Dean Job's riveting account of the audacious swindle. and a Book of the Year selection by the Chicago Writers Association. Laurie Kahn has spent 30 years offering trauma counseling to abused children. Now she brings that experience to bear in her new book, Baffled by Love. Pulitzer Prize winner Blair Kamen is one of the longest-serving architecture critics in the nation, and author of Why Architecture Matters, Lessons from Chicago. And he has some new ones in the building boom we're in now. The legends of Chicago's gay community are celebrated in 3 biographies. Owen Keenan co-authored with Tracy Baim. But Keenan is also the author of Young Digby Swank, about a Chicago boy growing up in a Catholic world.
He did the mash. He did the monster mash. The monster mash.
You might call Scott Kennymore a professional zombie hunter. His novels have found him in Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and this year in the White House. This one is called Zombie in Chief, Eater of the Free World.
I know a place, y'all. I'll take you there. Ain't nobody crying.
Chicago Tribune rock critic Greg Kot is one half NPR's Sound Opinions. He'll tell you he's the sounder one. But he's with us tonight as the author of our current One Book, One Chicago selection. This story, you hear her, Mavis Staples, the Staples Singers, and the music behind the Civil Rights era. And if you think hosting this is a cushy gig, try being the author of a photo book. Yes, I wrote a few words for Chicago Visions, but the real stars are the photographers whose work gives us Chicago all its grit and glory. You probably know Victoria Lautman as the longtime host of cultural programs on WBEZ, but she is also a journalist and art historian who spent 5 years uncovering the vanishing stepwells of India, a breathtaking glimpse into the country's history and culture. Zachary Leader must get the prize for traveling the farthest to be with us tonight, a Pulitzer Prize finalist for his biography of Kingsley Amis. This English professor from the University of Roehampton is also the author of a new biography about Saul Bellow. Howard Levy is a master of the harmonica. His musical journeys into jazz, pop, rock, and classical music have made him world-renowned indeed, with 2 Grammy Awards for Bella Fleck and the Fleck Tones. Anthony Licata is the partner in charge of the Taft Law Firm in Chicago, but his fascination with ancient Rome brings us his first novel about love, murder, and deceit in the time of Hannibal. Richard Lindbergh has explored Chicago history in 18 books. Now the past president of the Society of Midland Authors turns that curiosity on his own family in The Whiskey Breakfast. Sounds interesting, his memoir of growing up in Andersonville. David Stewart McLean is an exceedingly entertaining psychotic, says the New York Times. McLean woke up one morning in India with no memory of anything that had gone before, and he spent the next 3 years piecing himself together, and the answer to the riddle is me. Barbara Mahaney has shared her family life with us for over 30 years in her Chicago Tribune column. Now she talks about the sorrows, joys, and hallelujahs of being a mom in mother prayer. 500 years ago, Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation, and no one knows his story better than Martin Marty, Professor Emeritus at the University of Chicago and winner of the National Book Award for Righteous Empire. He gave me a little tidbit that I am going to say tonight because I don't want to get beaten in a news story. Instead of nailing his Reformation proclamation to the door, he mailed it. And I said, mail? I thought that was Ben Franklin. Anyway, you can look it up. Eric Charles May is a reporter, a teacher, and storyteller extraordinaire, as you can see in Bedrock Faith, which also won our 21st Century Award. Elizabeth McChesney deserves a spot on this podium, if only for her lifelong work running children's programs at the library. This year, she and Brian Munar from the Museum of Science and Industry have a new book out, That explains how the library's Summer Learning Challenge became a national model. Nabi Moon went from being a homeless teenager selling Avon door to door to the winner of our 21st Century Award. Her novel, Miles from Nowhere, exposed the painful difficulties of a life lived on the margins. When the Rolling Stones call, you answer. Paul Natkin answered, and 200,000 photos later, he is Chicago's most famous rock and roll photographer, and also the nicest. Elise Passion was the longtime director of the Poetry Society of America, and her latest collection draws you into what she called a life lived and a life imagined. Arthur Melville Pearson is a self-described city guy who has spent the last 20 years tirelessly preserving Illinois' tallgrass prairie. Force of Nature is his tribute to the founder of the Natural Areas movement. Business professor Suzanne Penn, or Dr. Sue as she likes to be called, draws on 36 years in the business to help women find their life-work balance in the Pink Corner Office. As the Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law at the University of Chicago, Eric Posner's opinions are cited in more courtrooms than any other legal scholar. So you can imagine he has a lot of them. And you can read them regularly on the op-ed pages of the New York Times. Lori Raider Day is on a crime spree. Her first 2 novels won Mary Higgins Clark Awards. And her latest, The Day I Died, is another spine-chilling cliffhanger. There are many ways to start writing, but how many writers start out as puppeteers? Mary Robinette Kowal did, and her fantasy novels have gone on to win 3 Hugo Awards. Oh, I know he's saying something, but I can't figure out what. Maybe something about the Cubs. Thank you. Kathleen Rooney teaches creative writing at DePaul, writes poetry on demand as a founder of Poetry While You Wait, and revels in the idiosyncrasies of life. You will too, in her new novel, Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk. Unexpected, uncategorizable, and unputdownable. Those are some of the words inspired by Augustus Rose's debut novel. You see, when a teenage girl gets caught shoplifting, then escapes from a mental home to join a gang who somehow have stolen a Marcel Duchamp painting that holds the key to immortality, well, it's complicated. Wait, don't tell me. No, Peter Sagal is in the house. My compatriot from NPR is an expert on many things, as you will see in the book of Vice. But I'll bet you don't know he has a memoir coming out next spring called Keep Going. I'll bet you drew upon the book of Vice for that memoir. Thank you, Peter. Erica Sanchez's parents crossed the Tijuana border in 1978 in the trunk of an old Cadillac, and they have lived in Cicero ever since. Their daughter, meanwhile, has been scooping up awards and scholarships like there's no tomorrow. Her new novel, I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, is one of the most anticipated young adult books of the season. Donna Seaman is one of those indispensable people in the literary world, promoting authors as an editor at Booklist, writing reviews as the winner of the James Friend Award, and in her new book, rediscovering 7 American women artists. Glenn Schuld's awkward high school years in Evanston put him in touch with intolerance in all shades in The Color of Character. Scott Simon has won every award you could win in broadcasting and published 8 books, but underneath it all, his heart pumps Cubby Bear Blue. My Cubs is his account of how he lived to see the first World Series pennant fly over Wrigley Field in 106 years. I know you're counting on this year, Scott. Don't. All right. Dick Simpson, there's one more, I know. Dick Simpson has been fighting for political reform since his days as a Chicago alderman. Now a professor at UIC, he explores some of the most notorious scandals in corrupt Illinois.
Girl, set you hallelujah. Girl, set you hallelujah. 'Cause Uptown Funk don't give it to you. 'Cause Uptown Funk don't give it to you. 'Cause Uptown Funk don't give it to you. Saturday night and we in the spot. Don't believe me, just watch.
I just had to play that. It's my favorite video from a remarkable First Lady whose story is told in a remarkable book by Peter Slevin, a former Washington Post reporter now teaching at Northwestern. Our last 21st century author is Christine Sneed, the director of Northwestern's Master's Program in Creative Writing and the author of 2 novels and 2 short story collections. Sex and the Constitution ought to get your attention and send you back to law school. Yes, that is the latest in a long line of distinguished books from the University of Chicago law professor Jeffrey Stone. But I have to warn you, it is more about the law than it is about sex. Although these days, no. 50 years ago, the Picasso made its debut in Dealey Plaza, and it's been amusing and confounding onlookers ever since. To commemorate the anniversary, art historian Patricia Balton Stratton offers up the inside story on how it all came about. Elizabeth Taylor put her brand on the Chicago literary scene for 2 decades as literary editor at the Tribune and a founder of the National Book Review. But she's left her imprint on Chicago politics forever with her classic biography of Richard J. Daley, American Pharaoh. Mason Thomas has no problem immersing himself in fantasy worlds or creating them in 2 science fiction novels. Scott Turow was with us last year as an honored recipient of our Carl Sandburg Award. His books have been translated into 40 languages and sold more than 300 million copies, and he returns this year with a new novel that leaves Chicago behind to find intrigue in the Hague investigation of the Bosnian War. 20 years ago, Tom Weinberg became enthralled by a fanciful rumor of a lost city in the Amazon. Last year, after LIDAR aerial imaging pinpointed a likely location, he joined a team of archaeologists dropped in by helicopter to find it. Chasing the lost city is his account of the artifacts they discovered and their near-death experience bringing them out. Our 21st Century Award winner is Natalie Moore. You may recognize her voice as a reporter on WBEZ, but her account of growing up on the South Side is a deep dive into the economic and racial politics that divide Chicago. And the winners of our Carl Sandburg Awards are Dave Eggers, a Lake Forest boy who traveled the world writing about our common human traits and returns home tonight to receive his just reward. And Margaret Atwood.
Okay. And the Emmy goes to The Handmaid's Tale!
Nobody says it better than Oprah, Margaret, so we'll let it speak for itself. We'll hear from you later. But that's only one of 40 books that she has written in her remarkable career. We ask for your standing applause for our 84 authors in Chicago.